Good morning, Channel Niners. So today I'm here down at Microsoft Research in Cambridge, and I'm very pleased to be talking to Don Syme, the creator of F#. And we're going to be talking a little bit about some of the benefits of programming as a developer using F#. So Don, great to be speaking to you.
Wonderful to have you guys here at Microsoft Research in Cambridge, the home of F# and many other
Absolutely. I always love coming down here and actually seeing the way you guys are changing the future. So it's a pleasure to be here again. So perhaps you could start, Don, by just giving people a little bit of an overview of the language and where it's come from, the history.
Sure. There's two ways of looking at this. You can kind of look back in time and look back, to what was I thinking back in 2003 and how the .NET platform was then and so on. And then you can also look at what we have today and why F# is such a compelling addition to the .NET platform today. When we look back, I guess the really big motivation was to bring functional programming to the .NET platform and bring the .NET platform to functional programming as well. So we knew from experience with a range of typed functional programming languages that it is an extremely effective programming paradigm. But there wasn't a strong applied implementation of type functional programming in a modern context like .NET, where we could explore, well, how useful is this really in practice? And by bringing F# to the .NET platform, we've then, in the 5 years as the project has developed, we've been able to just explore which problem domains is it extremely useful for, and we've been able to refine the paradigm and add some really key elements to it, for instance, particularly with regard to, say, parallel and asynchronous programming, which just sort of multiply what we already knew was an extremely strong base and multiply that up even further to really bring it to be a highly effective modern programming paradigm.
Fantastic. And hopefully we're going to be able to spend some time throughout the series of these discussions talking about some of those examples later on. So as a developer getting into functional programming, getting into F#, how would one go about getting into learning the language? What's the best route into the language?
Right. Certainly in terms of learning the language, I think for most people, I'd recommend getting an F# book and getting the implementation of F# in Visual Studio 2010. It comes with Visual Studio 2010, or getting the free tools that works with the Visual Studio 2008 shell, for example, and we'll soon be publishing that for Visual Studio 2010 shell as well. And I would recommend a book. We've got a few of the books here. We've got Expert F# or Programming F#, the O'Reilly book, a great book to start with. And if you're interested in both the F# and C# angles, this is functional programming with examples in F# and C#. And really the thing to do is just sit down and just work through 10 pages, 20 pages, 30 pages of the introductory chapters of these books. And then usually the books have various applied topics towards the end, and just start to choose that area that interests you the most with regard to the applied topics and work through those, and you'll have got the paradigm, and you'll have got why the language is different and important in .NET development. Certainly you want to be hands-on in Visual Studio, especially with F# Interactive in Visual Studio, working through these samples.
Absolutely. And obviously there are going to be a number of different developers out there. There are going to be people that are great at C#. There perhaps be people that are less experienced with .NET languages, that might come from more of a scripting-based language background. Can you say anything about the similarities or differences between F# and coming from those different backgrounds, and how easy it may be to get into, or what the best route is in for someone that's a scripting programmer, someone that's a .NET developer?
The learning route will be similar. Just get down, just get your hands on, start using it, and it's a very simple and clear experience to just sit down with some of those examples and just understand the code and work through them. We were talking earlier about how the learning curve is shaped for different kinds of programs.
Yeah.
And over the last 5 years, we've got quite a good feel for that learning curve for different for different people. And if we take the C# programmer, typically what happens is you have some spare time, you have a bit of time, perhaps in the evenings, to learn a new paradigm, a new language. And there's some people who advocate learn a new language every year, just like you learn a new. I wouldn't go quite that far, but perhaps learn a new framework every year or something like that is a good idea. So they start by learning the language as I've described, and they then have some usually some applied project they want to develop in the language. I think you should learn the basics of the language first. You shouldn't just dive in with some major project. So the curve usually goes that there's a process of transliterating some C# code, for example, into F#. And people will notice that a whole lot of things actually become kind of simpler and more succinct, especially if you use the object-oriented programming in F#, which actually gives a very, very beautiful and succinct style of object-oriented programming. Still just as type-safe, just as strongly type-safe as in C#. But still, it looks kind of wrong in some way. Large parts of it look a little bit too transliterated from C#, and you kind of know that certain elements can be made more succinct or more functional, and you start to apply the functional programming paradigm to various parts of your code, and it's interesting to see how people the experience we have is that people feel that the end result is a more maintainable kind of piece of code, a more declarative, more succinct, clearer representation of the problem that original code was trying to solve.
So Don, people think about programming languages in all sorts of different ways. F#, is it a scripting language? Is it a functional language? Is it an object-oriented language? How would you place it in terms of the spectrum of language features?
Sure. So that's very important in understanding F#. We realized early on that what we were actually making with F# was a multi-paradigm language, a language where we have a combination of features. But the key thing is, I think, the key differentiator is that it is a functional first language for .NET. It's certainly an exploration first language, so most people's initial experience of using F# will be evaluating snippets in F# Interactive. And that's immediately a very different kind of methodology and a different kind of experience. I've had people sit through an F# introduction or read F# introductions on the net and say, look, it's sort of computationally, it's got the same elements as C# in some ways. But then they actually see development in F# with F# Interactive, and they realize that methodologically it's extremely different, and your entire way of thinking about problem solving comes first of all from interactive, and secondly from a functional, in terms of paradigms, it's a sort of functional first paradigm. And that kind of inversion of the way we tackle problems is actually key to F#. It's also key, for example, in parallel programming, that instead of dealing with all the starting with the complexity of memory models and shared memory and so on, we start with very simple and declarative parallel programming. So just as we start with simple and declarative functional programming, we start with simple and declarative parallel programming. And if necessary, you can do the other paradigms. You can, for instance, get an array and mutate the array and just run the typical array algorithm, which you have to do for some core computational components. But you'll typically be able to wrap that up in a compositional functional programming framework.
Don, you've mentioned the learning experiences that you've heard other people speak about. Do you have any examples of what people have said about their experiences in learning F# and how they found the journey?
Yeah, so we follow. I enjoy following people who blog about F# and about their experience of learning F#. And every now and then I know particular quotes which kind of seem to capture something in a typical learning experience. And I brought one of those along today, so I'll take a look at that. So this is someone who's learned the language and has been sort of recording regularly about their observations about using it. And he's actually at the point where he's starting a commercial project in F#. And yeah, I'll read this out. So he says he has a proof of concept port from C# to F#. And he's doing this because he understands that the combination of features that F# is bringing has enabled him to be highly productive in the kinds of domains he's interested in working in. And so it's quite useful for him to bring his existing projects over to F# as part of the sort of next step in learning to build enterprise or do commercial software. And importantly, one interesting thing he says, the good news is the developer downstream has agreed to accept the F# code into the production version. And that's one of the key things about F# at this stage in learning, is because it's a .NET language and you can encapsulate the use of F# at the .NET component boundary, then you're not forcing all downstream consumers of your components to switch to F#. They're just using the .NET component, and we see this is absolutely critical inside an enterprise as you adopt F#, is to choose projects where there's a sensible boundary where for the use of F#. Either you're implementing a web service, say inside a financial company, and you're just sitting implementing a server-side web service which can be consumed from multiple languages, or you're implementing a .NET component, or you're implementing a COM component. But it's absolutely kind of critical that you don't go down an architectural path where you expect your whole bank or your whole games company or something to be switching to F#. So that's a key step in thinking about transferring to your use of F#. So on his first cut at this component, he did more or less a transliteration approach, and he's I think by this stage good enough at F# object-oriented programming that as you transliterate, you kind of clean some things up, and the code tends to become clearer and more succinct, even in the process of transliteration. But often the architectural elements that are being used in, say, a C#, often more framework kind of approach, become a bit different as you translate across to F#. So he's done the transliteration, and as he says, as it went along, I was becoming more and more comfortable with F# and functional programming, and mixing these new skills and ideas with the object-oriented and imperative stuff. Okay, so then he does actually rewrite the core algorithm in core components in F#. That's not something you necessarily have to do, of course. You could just keep the transliteration. And he changes the organization a little bit, and he doesn't avoid the object-oriented and imperative constructs, but he doesn't let them drive the design anymore. So it's in F# at this stage, people are learning that you don't have to think about everything in terms of objects. Okay, you're just using them as a tool when necessary within your overall problem solving. So he says that the F# constructs meant he was able to decouple his components more, and that's again you find that in F#, that people tend to write more decoupled components and less of a framework approach.
Right. So the composition of those components then becomes an important building tool.
Yes, that's right. So people often draw a connection between this dependency management, dependency injection. And functional programming. There's a close match in thinking between these, in getting decoupled components. And how you stitch those together, there's various techniques you can use to stitch those together, like the dependency injection frameworks, but in terms of decoupling and the way of thinking, there's a lot of correspondence between the two at an architectural and a methodological kind of level. And he then says that the result of F-sharping the code is much cleaner, code that is much cleaner and easier to maintain. And there are even fewer lines of code than already in the reduced number in the transliterated version. and he actually used a couple of advanced features of F# to simplify some boilerplate in the code, really cut down some boilerplate, and that helped him keep the code readable, composable, and extensible. And the multi-paradigm nature of F# allowed him to mix declarative and imperative styles in a way that created simpler code than either style alone. And like oil and vinegar, the blend was more palatable than either alone.
So that's a great quote.
That's a quote.
Excellent.
And I'll finish up with what he says at the end. And if I ever do need to take it back to C#, the ideas that I got from the F# port will make the code simpler and more extensible than the original. And F# I feel is an excellent language for exploring ideas and designs, even if the final version ends up in some other language. And I'm so impressed that I plan to port other portions of the project to F#, at least on a trial basis.
Fantastic.
I think that's testimonial for
exactly, and it's a great example of sort of the learning curve that someone has gone through in taking C# background to an F# project.
Yes.
So, talking of which, are there any examples that we could just spend a few minutes looking at that would highlight some of the great fit of the language for expressing, boiling down a problem space into a particular set of functions?
Right. So often when we're talking about F#'s use based on Visual Studio 2010, we'll be talking about core computational components, often within some larger application or larger framework, and we see this being repeated again and again. So I think later on today we'll be talking with the people who developed the Path of Go game, and in that case the AI engine is written in F#, and that's running on the Xbox 360. In the case of, say, the use of F# in a financial company to do risk analysis, that will be often done again as core